Seeking help from your doctor or another professional is always a wise choice. Your doctor may be able to treat your depression through medication, and therapy can also help. Even if your doctor prescribes medication for your depression, it can be very helpful to supplement this with coping skills. One skill which has shown amazing results is to change how you think. Let's go back to the whiteboard to learn how this is done.
Here's a little secret. If you want to change the way you feel, you need to change the way that you think. The truth is that the ways in which we think very much influence how we feel. Our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors are all very much tied into one another and interconnected. If we change any one of these three components, we will probably see a change in the other two. You cannot separate how you feel from how you think, or how you think from how you feel, or how you feel from how you behave. If you change one, the others will change as well. That being the case, if you want to change how you feel, you have to change how you think. Easier said than done? It is. Changing your thinking is not something that can happen overnight, and it's not going to change simply because you read a book or watch a video or make a decision one day to change your thinking. Changing your thinking is a discipline that you have to practice over and over and over. What do I mean by changing your thinking? Well, let me ask you this. If you have two people, and one of those people is an optimist and always tends to look at the bright side of things, while the other is a pessimist and always tends to look at the bad side of things, which of these two people is more likely to suffer from depression? Obviously, the pessimist is the more likely of the two to be depressed. There's no difference at all between the optimist and the pessimist except how they have trained themselves to think. The optimist has trained himself to focus on the positive, and the pessimist has trained himself to focus on the negative. When we focus on the negative, we become depressed. One aspect of depressed thinking is that we tend to ruminate or dwell on negative thoughts. We turn these thoughts over and over and over in our heads, replaying memories and scenarios endlessly, looking at every single aspect of a negative situation and generally brooding over the negative aspects of our life. We become so good at this that it becomes a habit and almost a favorite pastime. Brooding over negative thoughts and memories can lead to depression, and once we're depressed, brooding and ruminating can keep us depressed. As we turn our thoughts inward and focus on the negative and the sad and the painful, we begin to feel negative and sad and full of pain. I'm sure you've heard before that you are what you eat. There's another saying which is equally as true. You feel what you think. So how do you break the rumination habit? Well, the first step is to become aware of what you're thinking. This takes a little bit of practice to begin monitoring yourself and your thinking throughout the day. In his book, The Depression Cure, Dr. Stephen Ilardi recommends that you set the alarm clock on your cell phone to beep once an hour. Every time the cell phone beeps, check yourself for what you are thinking about and how much time you spent brooding on the negative. You may be surprised at how much time you've actually focused on depressing thoughts. The next step is to begin learning how to redirect your thinking. Once you become aware of your negative thinking, it's important to break yourself out of the brooding behavior. You can do this by intentionally focusing on something more positive. Picking up a telephone and calling somebody. Starting a conversation with someone. Or finding an activity to engage in that will hold your attention. The important thing is that you interrupt the negative thought process and redirect your attention to something more positive. Being around positive people will help you to develop more positive attitudes yourself. We tend to mimic the attitudes of those that we hang around with. If you're spending all of your time with negative people, you should look at ways in which you can begin to limit your time with them and spend more time with positive people. As we grow up and mature into adults, we sometimes learn how to think in somewhat distorted and irrational ways. Sometimes we acquire irrational beliefs which distort our thinking. For example, we sometimes develop unrealistic expectations about ourselves or about others. If I begin to think that I must always do everything perfectly and never make any mistakes, what happens when I do make a mistake? I become very disappointed in myself. And if I begin to dwell upon how disappointed I am, I might end up making myself depressed. What leads to that in the first place? Well, it was a belief that I formed about myself that I must never fail. That's kind of an extreme belief, isn't it? After all, I'm human and I'm going to fail at certain things. If I hold on to a belief that I must never fail, I'm going to be continuously disappointed in myself and probably become depressed. What if, on the other hand, I'm able to modify that belief? Maybe instead of believing that I must never fail, I can moderate that belief to something a little less extreme, like I would prefer to not fail, but if I do fail, it's not the end of the world. Now, instead of becoming depressed when I fail, I become sad and disappointed, but not depressed. If I can find a way to moderate my thinking, I can also moderate my emotions. Instead of having extreme thoughts which lead to extreme emotions, like depression, I try to have moderate and realistic thoughts which lead to more moderate and manageable emotional responses. Choosing what we focus on in our thinking and choosing to focus on the positive rather than the negative will go a long ways towards helping us to avoid and alleviate our depression.
For some reason, weekends were always tough for me. What I did was I set up a standing breakfast date with my sister for every Sunday morning. This forced me to get out of bed, shower, get dressed, and go to the cafe. There were a lot of Sundays when I really didn't want to go, but I felt like I'd be letting my sister down if I didn't show. Once I got to the restaurant and started talking with my sister, I would start feeling quite a bit better. This almost always helped to pull me out of my depression. I actually ended up with a pretty good relationship with my sister.
A classic example of focusing on the positive instead of the negative is the way in which we choose to view ourselves and our value. This is sometimes called self-esteem, and it's very much influenced by whether we focus on the positive or focus on the negative. If I dwell on what's wrong with me, I'll probably end up with really low self-esteem. If, on the other hand, I dwell on what's right about me, I'll probably end up with really good self-esteem. This doesn't mean that I have to delude myself about my shortcomings. I'm aware that there are things about me which I don't necessarily like and would like to change, but I don't focus on those things. Instead, I place my focus on what I like about myself. If I do that, I end up with better self-esteem, and I'm less likely to become depressed.
I really had to change the way I was thinking. Instead of focusing on what I didn't like about me, I began forcing myself to focus on what I did like about me. And the more I did that, the more I noticed I began to like myself, and my depression became less severe.
It's important to begin looking for ways in which you think in these negative thought patterns. Here's a few more examples. Black or white thinking. This is thinking in very rigid terms with no real middle ground. It's either black or it's white, and we'll just ignore the entire spectrum of colors and shades between the two. For example, if I'm not the perfect parent, I'm a total failure. Or, I have to be a better salesman than everybody else in my company, or else I'm not worth anything. Is it possible that I could still fail at certain parenting tasks and be a very good parent? Sure. Could I be the second best salesman in the company and still be a darn good salesman? Absolutely. But when we think in terms of black or white, we don't allow for these possibilities that something could be less than perfect but still good. Diminishing the positive. Have you ever done something that was really cool or had some really good achievement, but you couldn't fully enjoy it because it was a little less than perfect? How about when somebody compliments you on your appearance, and in your head you're thinking, yeah, but my nose is too big? Rather than focusing on the positives, we diminish the positive, and we argue as to why the positive isn't really true and doesn't really matter because there's some little tiny negative aspect that we zero in on and focus on instead. This is diminishing the positive. Negative self-talk. How many times have you looked in the mirror and said, I'm ugly? Or made a mistake and told yourself, I'm such an idiot. How about this one? I never do anything right. Or I'm such a failure. Talking about ourselves in negative terms like these means that we're thinking about ourselves in negative terms like these, and that's totally counterproductive to having a happy life. Chances are nobody else thinks you're an idiot because you made a simple mistake or that you're a failure because you had some setbacks in life. Why should you think these things about yourself? All of these different aspects of our thinking, our tendency to brood and ruminate, our negative thought patterns, our unrealistic expectations for ourselves and for others, our tendency to focus on the negative rather than the positive, these all combine to affect our emotions in a very negative way. Remember, the way that we think is always going to be reflected in the way that we feel. If we want to feel better, we need to learn how to think better.
It's truly amazing how changing the way we think can dramatically change the way we feel.
Thank you for watching this YouTube video. If you'd like to find more free recovery and mental health videos, free treatment resources, or if you'd like to visit our blog, just click on this link. I hope to see you soon.